40 million cars. Let that number sink in for a moment. 40 million automobiles. Enough vehicles to give one to every single person in California. Enough cars that if you lined them up bumper to bumper, they would wrap around the earth. Twice. 40 million cars built by American hands, in American factories, for American families. 40 million engines that roared to life on Friday nights at drive-in theaters, on Saturday mornings at Little League games, on Sunday drives to Grandma's house. And in 2009, General Motors killed the entire brand in 90 days. Not 90 months, not 90 weeks, 90 days. 12 weeks to dismantle 84 years of American automotive history, to shutter 2,600 dealerships, to eliminate every single job in Pontiac's engineering, design, and marketing divisions, to tell the world that one of America's most iconic car brands wasn't worth saving. Your father probably drove a Pontiac. Your grandfather almost certainly did. If you grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s, you remember when Pontiac meant something. When we build excitement wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise. The GTO didn't just start a car category, it invented the American muscle car. The Firebird Trans Am became so famous that Hollywood couldn't stop putting it in movies. The Bonneville was the car that told your neighbors you'd made it. You'd arrived. You were living the American dream. And all of it, every single model, every racing trophy, every memory, was executed by a corporate death squad in a Manhattan bankruptcy courtroom in the summer of 2009. Here's what makes this story different from every other factory closure. See every other sad tale of American industrial decline. Pontiac wasn't losing money because nobody wanted its cars. At its peak, Pontiac sold over 1 million vehicles per year. That's more than one car every 30 seconds around the clock, 365 days a year. Pontiac didn't die because Americans stopped loving it. Pontiac died because General Motors stopped caring about it. For 3 decades, GM's leadership systematically stripped Pontiac of everything that made it special. They took away its unique engines. They took away its distinctive styling. They forced Pontiac to sell rebadged Chevrolets with different nameplates. They turned the Excitement division into a glorified trim package. And then, when nobody wanted to buy these hollow shells of former glory, GM executives had the audacity to say Pontiac was no longer viable. They didn't kill Pontiac. They murdered it slowly over 30 years, then blamed the corpse for dying. But this story doesn't start with corporate betrayal and bankruptcy courts. It starts the way all great American stories start, with an immigrant son, a small Michigan town, and a dream that anybody could build something extraordinary in this country. It starts with a man named Edward Murphy, who looked at the future and saw something nobody else could see. It starts in 1907, in a factory that built horse-drawn carriages. And it starts with a wild bet that the automobile, this noisy, unreliable, expensive toy for rich people, would someday change the world. This is the story of Pontiac, the cars that built excitement, the workers who built America, and the corporation that threw it all away. August 28, 1907. William Howard Taft is about to become president. The Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk just 4 years earlier. Most Americans have never seen an automobile in person, let alone driven one. And in Pontiac, Michigan, a small industrial city 30 miles north of Detroit, a carriage maker named Edward M. Murphy is about to make the biggest gamble of his life. Murphy wasn't a dreamer or a tinkerer. He was a practical businessman who'd spent decades building horse-drawn carriages, good carriages, carriages with fine craftsmanship and solid engineering, the kind of carriages that the growing middle class of industrial Michigan wanted to buy. But Murphy saw something in 1907 that a lot of carriage makers refused to see. The horse was finished. Not tomorrow, not next year, but soon. The automobile was coming, whether the carriage industry liked it or not. So on that August day, Murphy founded the Oakland Motor Car Company, named after Oakland County, Michigan, where the factory stood. A small operation, maybe a few dozen workers at first, converting his carriage expertise into automobile manufacturing. The first Oakland automobiles weren't glamorous. They weren't the fastest or the most stylish or the cheapest. They were solid, dependable working-class cars for working-class families. Cars built by craftsmen who understood that when a farmer in rural Michigan bought a vehicle, he needed it to start every morning and run every mile. But here's where the story takes its first tragic turn. Edward Murphy never got to see what his company would become. On August 28th, 1909, exactly 2 years to the day after he founded Oakland Motor Car Company, Edward Murphy died. The cause isn't clear in the historical record, but the timing is almost poetic. 2 years to build a foundation, then gone. Just 5 months earlier, in January 1909, something else had happened. A corporate giant named General Motors, founded just a year before by William Durant, had purchased a half-interest in Oakland Motor Car Company. When Murphy died, GM swept in and took full control. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to understand how General Motors operated in those early years. Durant was a collector. He didn't want to build one car company. He wanted to own every car company. Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland. He bought them all, often paying in GM stock rather than cash, accumulating brands like trading cards. So Oakland was just one small piece of a growing empire. For the next 17 years, Oakland plugged along. Decent cars, modest sales, nothing spectacular. The kind of division that GM executives forgot existed until they looked at the quarterly reports. But in 1926, everything changed. Oakland's general manager, a man named Alfred Glancy, had an idea. What if Oakland introduced a companion car, a slightly smaller, slightly cheaper model that would slot below Oakland in GM's brand hierarchy? It would share components with Oakland to keep costs down, but have its own identity and its own dealerships. They called it the Pontiac, named after the city where it was born, named after the Ottawa war chief who had fought against British colonization in the 1760s. The logo, that distinctive arrowhead with the Native American profile, would become one of the most recognized symbols in automotive history. And here's the incredible part. Pontiac was only supposed to be a supporting player, the junior partner to Oakland. It didn't work out that way. From the moment Pontiac hit the market, it outsold Oakland. Not by a little, by a lot. American families didn't want the Oakland with its old-fashioned styling and premium prices. They wanted the fresh, modern, affordable Pontiac. By 1932, General Motors made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just 6 years earlier. They killed Oakland entirely. The parent company was discontinued. The companion car had devoured its creator. Pontiac became its own division, its own factory, its own identity. The factory at 1000 South Opdyke Road in Pontiac, Michigan, became the heart of a new automotive empire. 3 million square feet of manufacturing space, foundries and stamping plants and assembly lines stretching as far as the eye could see. This was where Pontiac would build its legend. Think about what it meant to work at Pontiac in those days. The Depression was crushing the country. A quarter of American workers had no job at all. But if you got hired at Pontiac, you had something precious. A steady paycheck, a chance to feed your family, a reason to hold your head up high. And you weren't just assembling cars. You were building something that mattered, something that moved, something that families would drive for decades, that would carry children to school and couples to church and grandparents to hospitals. You were building the American dream, one Pontiac at a time. But the best was yet to come. In 1941, Pontiac made a small change that would prove revolutionary. They became the first American automaker to let customers choose their engine. You want a 6-cylinder for fuel economy? You got it. You want an 8-cylinder for power? It's yours. It sounds obvious now. Every car company does it. But in 1941, Pontiac invented the concept of engine option selection, the first step toward the customization culture that would define American automotive enthusiasm for generations. Then came the war. When Pearl Harbor pulled America into World War II, Pontiac stopped making cars entirely. The assembly line that had rolled out thousands of family sedans converted to military production. So the same skilled hands that built engines for Sunday drives now built Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft cannons for the United States Navy. By the time the war ended in 1945, Pontiac had proven something important. This wasn't just a car company. This was a piece of America's industrial arsenal. The workers at Pontiac Assembly had helped win a world war. Now they would help build a post-war boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. The golden age was about to begin. Close your eyes and picture America in 1955. Eisenhower is in the White House. The economy is booming. The interstate highway system is spreading across the nation like a nervous system of asphalt and ambition. Suburbs are sprouting from farmland. 2-car garages are becoming standard. And for the first time in human history, the average working family can afford to own not just one automobile, but 2. This was Pontiac's moment. In 1957, Pontiac introduced a car that would define American luxury for a generation. The Bonneville. Wide track stance. Powerful V8 engine. More chrome than a 1950s diner. The Bonneville announced to your neighbors, without you having to say a word, that you'd made it. You were middle class. You were successful. You were living the dream. But Pontiac wasn't content with just being comfortable. In a cramped engineering office in Detroit, a young executive named John DeLorean, yes, that John DeLorean, was cooking up something that would change American automotive culture forever. The year was 1963. General Motors had a corporate policy that no intermediate-sized car could have an engine larger than 330 cubic inches. So it was a safety rule, supposedly. Keep the young hotheads from putting too much power in lightweight cars. DeLorean looked at that rule and found a loophole you could drive a truck through. The rule said engine size was limited in standard models. But what if the big engine was an option? What if you let customers check a box and upgrade to a 389 cubic inch V8, a full-sized engine in a mid-sized body? On paper, it was just an option package. In reality, it was the birth of the American muscle car. The 1964 Pontiac GTO stood for Gran Turismo Omologato, an Italian racing term that Pontiac brazenly appropriated from Ferrari. The audacity of it. A $3,000 American car borrowing its name from European racing royalty. But here's the thing. The GTO backed up that audacity with raw, pavement-shredding performance. Car and Driver magazine tested a GTO and declared it the best handling car they'd ever reviewed. Motor Trend fell over themselves praising it. And regular Americans? They bought over 32,000 GTOs in that first year, triple what Pontiac had projected. By the peak years of the late 1960s, GTO sales topped 100,000 units annually. Pontiac had created not just a car, but a cultural movement. In 1967, Pontiac struck again with the Firebird. If the GTO was a street brawler, the Firebird was a dancer, nimble, aggressive, gorgeous. It came in variants from practical to insane, topped by the legendary Formula and Trans Am models. And speaking of the Trans Am, when Pontiac introduced the Trans Am package in 1969, they created something that would transcend automotive history and enter American mythology. Named after the Trans-American Racing Series, the Trans Am took everything aggressive about the Firebird and dialed it up to 11. But it was in 1977 that the Trans Am became immortal. A movie called Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters, starring Burt Reynolds and a black and gold 1977 Trans Am. That car wasn't just product placement. It was a co-star. It jumped bridges. It outran police. It made every teenage boy in America desperate to own one. The year before the movie, Pontiac sold about 50,000 Trans Ams. By 1979, they were selling 116,535 per year. One movie, more than doubled sales. That's the power of an iconic product. And don't forget, the Bandit himself, Burt Reynolds, became so associated with Pontiac that it was practically a celebrity endorsement deal that cost nothing. Steve McQueen drove a Pontiac in Bullitt. Trans Ams showed up in Knight Rider, American Graffiti, and dozens of other films and TV shows. Pontiac didn't just make cars. Pontiac made American culture. Now let me take you inside the machine that made all this possible. The Pontiac assembly plant sprawled across more than 100 acres of Michigan industrial land. Over 3 million square feet of manufacturing space. That's larger than 50 football fields under one roof. Buildings for stamping, buildings for body assembly, buildings for paint, buildings for final assembly. A city within a city. At peak production in the 1960s, this single factory could turn out more than 1,000 Pontiacs per day. Think about that. One car rolling off the line every minute or so around the clock, shift after shift. The machinery never stopped. The line never slept. The sounds of that factory became a kind of music to the workers who spent their lives there. The rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk of the stamping presses, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the rumble of V8 engines firing up for the first time, the shouts of line workers calling out to each other over the industrial symphony. The plant ran 2 shifts, sometimes 3 when demand was high. Workers would pass each other at the shift change, exhausted men heading home as fresh crews arrived. They'd exchange nods, maybe a few words about how the line was running, then back to work. And the technology? For its time, cutting edge. Pontiac's engineers had developed innovations like the tri-power carburetor system, 3 2-barrel carburetors working in sequence, that became legendary among gearheads. The factory had some of the most advanced V8 engine production facilities in the world. But the real technology wasn't the machines. It was the humans operating them. At its peak, over 10,000 workers punched the clock at Pontiac Assembly. 10,000 people, 10,000 families, 10,000 American dreams, all tied to this one factory in this one Michigan city. Let me tell you what that job meant in 1965. A line worker at Pontiac Assembly made between $3 and $4 an hour. Doesn't sound like much now, but adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to about $25 to $30 an hour today. Solidly middle class. More importantly, look at what that wage could buy. A 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood? Maybe $15,000. A new Pontiac in the driveway? $3,000. With a single income, a Pontiac worker could buy a home, raise a family, take vacations, and put money away for retirement. And that wasn't by accident. That was the United Auto Workers. If you remember when America made the best cars in the world, when a factory job could support a family, hit that subscribe button. We're documenting the rise and fall of American industry, one factory at a time. And trust me, this story gets worse before it gets better. The UAW had fought for those wages, those benefits, those protections. Hard-won contracts guaranteed not just paychecks, but health care for the whole family. Pension plans that meant you could actually retire with dignity after 30 years on the line. Paid vacation so a father could take his kids to see the Grand Canyon. Pontiac wasn't just an employer, it was a community. The company sponsored baseball teams and bowling leagues. Annual picnics brought families together. Workers read the company newsletter to keep up on factory news and local gossip. Generations of families worked side by side, fathers and sons, sometimes grandfathers too, all building Pontiacs together. Average tenure at the plant stretched beyond 20 years. People didn't job hop in those days. You got hired at Pontiac, you worked at Pontiac, you retired from Pontiac. Your work friends became your real friends. Your co-workers' kids played with your kids. The factory Christmas party was the social event of the year. And when you hit 30 years and decided to hang it up, the company threw you a party, gave you a watch, your buddies signed a card. You walked out those factory gates for the last time, knowing that your pension check would arrive every month like clockwork, that your health care was covered, that you'd earned your rest. This was the social contract. This was what work meant in America. And the city of Pontiac thrived right alongside the factory. More than 20% of the city's employment came from that single plant. Restaurants and bars and stores clustered around the factory gates, collecting paychecks on Friday afternoons. Homes were built to house the workers. Schools were funded by property taxes paid by workers. Churches filled on Sundays with workers and their families. The factory was the town, and the town was the factory. The population swelled past 100,000. Property values climbed. The tax base grew. Pontiac, Michigan, wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. This was peak American manufacturing. One company, one product, lifting an entire region into the middle class. For decades, it seemed like it would last forever. It didn't. October 1973, the Arab members of OPEC declared an oil embargo against the United States. Overnight, the price of gasoline quadrupled. Suddenly, that powerful V8 in your Pontiac wasn't a status symbol anymore. It was an anchor around your ankle, draining your wallet with every trip to the gas station. Americans looked around for alternatives, and for the first time, they started looking overseas. Japanese automakers had been a joke in the 1960s. Cheap little cars that could barely survive American highways. But while Detroit was building bigger engines and longer tail fins, Toyota and Honda and Datsun were quietly perfecting something else: reliability and fuel efficiency. When the oil shocks hit, they were ready. Detroit wasn't. Yeah, it got worse in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution triggered a second oil crisis. Gas lines stretched around city blocks. President Carter went on television asking Americans to turn down their thermostats. And Pontiac, whose entire brand identity was built on power and excitement, found itself selling gas-guzzling dinosaurs in a world that suddenly wanted fuel sippers. By 1980, Japanese cars claimed over 20% of the American market, up from almost nothing 20 years before. Toyota alone was outselling Pontiac. The transformation happened so fast that Detroit's executives seemed paralyzed, but foreign competition was only part of the problem. Here's where the real betrayal begins. General Motors, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the solution to competition wasn't to make Pontiac better, and it was to make Pontiac cheaper. Starting in the 1980s, GM implemented something called badge engineering. The concept was simple. Instead of designing unique cars for Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Chevrolet, why not design one car and put different nameplates on it? On paper, it made sense. Share platforms, share engines, share components, reduce costs. In practice, it was suicide. If a Pontiac Grand Am was basically a Chevrolet Cavalier with different headlights, why pay the Pontiac premium? If a Pontiac Bonneville was just a Buick LeSabre with a different grille, what exactly was a Pontiac? The executives who made these decisions never seemed to ask that question. They were too busy looking at spreadsheet savings to notice they were destroying the very thing that made Pontiac valuable: its identity. And it went deeper than just shared platforms. GM's corporate culture in the 1980s and 1990s became obsessed with short-term profits. Quarterly earnings, stock price, executive bonuses, long-term investments in quality. Cut them. Research and development for exciting new models. Reduce it. Worker training and facility upgrades. Defer them. Just hit those quarterly numbers. Keep the analysts happy. Keep the bonuses flowing. James Hoagland, a veteran Pontiac engineer, later described the problem in devastating terms. There was no passion for the product. The product had to fit what was going on in the corporate system. No passion for the product. From a car company that used to build excitement. The first major layoffs hit in the early 1980s. Economic recession combined with Japanese competition meant GM needed to cut costs, and thousands of workers received pink slips. The company said it was temporary. A response to market conditions. Things would bounce back, but the closures kept coming. Not Pontiac Assembly, not yet, but other GM plants across the Midwest. Flint, Lordstown, Oklahoma City. One by one, the manufacturing empire that had seemed permanent began to shrink. Workers who remained watched anxiously. Every rumor that filtered down from the executive floors in Detroit sent a ripple of fear through the assembly line. Was their plant next? Was their shift going to be cut? Were their jobs safe? Market share told the story. In the 1960s, Pontiac commanded more than 10% of the American automotive market. By the late 1980s, that number was falling. By the 1990s, it was in single digits. But the most damning indicator was something you couldn't put in a chart: the cars themselves. Look at a 1968 GTO. That car has personality, aggression, soul. Now look at a 1998 Grand Am. That car has... what? It's fine. It's transportation. But it's not exciting. It's not something that makes your heart beat faster. And that was the whole point of Pontiac. That was the brand promise. We build excitement. By the 1990s, the only excitement Pontiac was building was figuring out which Chevrolet they were going to rebadge next. Then came the Aztek. The year was 2001. Pontiac's leadership, desperate for something new and different, approved a crossover SUV design that looked like nothing else on the road. Unfortunately, it looked like nothing else on the road because nothing else on the road was that ugly. Car critics eviscerated it. The public mocked it. Time magazine eventually named it one of the worst cars ever built. The Aztek became a symbol of how far Pontiac had fallen, from the brand that created the GTO to the brand that created this thing. But even the Aztek's failure couldn't prepare anyone for what came next. In 2002, Pontiac unveiled something that seemed to promise a revival: the Solstice, a gorgeous two-seat roadster that recalled the brand's sporty heritage. It won design awards. It generated waiting lists at dealerships. People were actually excited about a Pontiac again. But GM couldn't get out of its own way. The Solstice was limited production. It never got the investment it deserved. It was a brilliant concept, starved by corporate indifference. By 2008, Pontiac sales had collapsed to 267,000 units. That's down from over 1 million at peak. To 3/4 of the brand's volume, gone. And then the financial crisis hit. This is the point where I have to ask, are you understanding now how this happened? I know this is frustrating to watch, seeing a great American brand slowly strangled by the same company that should have protected it. If you appreciate deep dive history that mainstream media won't cover, a like really helps. We've got 100 stories like this to tell, and your support makes that possible. September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The stock market plunged. The credit markets froze. The entire American economy, the entire global economy, teetered on the brink of catastrophe. And General Motors, the largest automaker in the world, was burning through cash at a rate of more than $1 billion per month. By November, GM's stock had fallen below $10, down from over $40 just a year before. The company announced it might run out of money by year's end without government assistance. The executives who had spent decades strip mining their brands for short-term profits now went to Washington with their hands out, begging Congress for bailout money. The imagery was devastating. CEOs of the big three automakers, GM, Ford, Chrysler, flying to Washington on private jets to ask for taxpayer money. They became symbols of corporate arrogance, of everything that had gone wrong with American capitalism. Congress initially refused. Public anger was too intense. Let them fail, people said. They brought this on themselves. But the alternative was terrifying. General Motors employed hundreds of thousands of workers directly, and millions more worked for suppliers and dealers. If GM collapsed, the Midwest would become an economic wasteland. By December, the Bush administration authorized emergency loans, a stopgap, a bridge to the incoming Obama administration, which would have to figure out what to do with a car company that was bleeding to death. The diagnosis came quickly. GM couldn't be saved as it existed. Too many brands, too many dealers, too much legacy cost. The company needed radical surgery, and someone had to be cut. April 27, 2009. Fritz Henderson, the CEO of General Motors, stepped to a podium to deliver the company's restructuring plan. The speech was clinical, corporate, designed to reassure investors and government overseers. But buried in that presentation was a death sentence for one of America's most storied automotive brands. Now Pontiac would be discontinued, not sold, not spun off, not given a chance to survive as an independent company. Discontinued, killed, erased. Henderson called it an extremely personal decision, but there was nothing personal about it. This was corporate triage. GM was keeping Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, and GMC. Everything else, Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, Saab, was being thrown overboard to keep the ship from sinking. The timeline was brutal. Pontiac franchise agreements would expire in October 2010. Dealers had roughly 18 months to wind down their operations. Some would convert to other GM brands. Others would simply close. 2,600 Pontiac dealerships across America, gone. Every engineer, every designer, every marketing person who worked on Pontiac products. Eliminated. 84 years of continuous production. 40 million cars. Finished. For the workers still on the line at Pontiac Assembly, the announcement was confirmation of their worst fears. They'd known for years that the brand was in trouble. They'd watched the sales decline, the product lineup shrink, the investment dry up. But hearing it officially, hearing that everything they'd built was going to be deliberately destroyed, was different. James Hoagland, the engineer who'd spent his career at Pontiac, described the feeling. The product had to fit what was going on in the corporate system, and it didn't. So they killed it. The last year and a half of Pontiac's existence was a long, slow funeral. Production of most models ended first. The G8 sedan, actually a pretty good car imported from Australia, was discontinued. The Solstice Roadster stopped rolling off the line. One by one, seats in the Pontiac stable was emptied. Only the G6 sedan hung on, building out remaining inventory until the very end. As October 2010 approached, the atmosphere at Pontiac Assembly became increasingly surreal. Workers were building cars for a brand that everyone knew was dead. Every vehicle that rolled off the line was one of the last. October 31st, 2010. Halloween, the day the ghosts came out. The last Pontiac ever built, a white G6 sedan, rolled off the assembly line in Orion Township, Michigan, where final production had been consolidated. Workers gathered around it. Some took photographs. Some touched the fender one last time. And that was it. After 103 years since Edward Murphy founded Oakland Motor Car Company, after 84 years since the first Pontiac rolled out of the factory, after 40 million cars delivered to American families, silence. The line stopped. The machinery went still. The workers clocked out for the last time and walked into an uncertain future. The closure of Pontiac didn't just affect factory workers. Over 7,000 jobs disappeared directly. But the ripple effects were far greater. Suppliers who had built their businesses around Pontiac production saw their orders vanish. Dealership employees, salespeople, mechanics, office staff lost their positions. Local businesses that had served the Pontiac workforce for generations watched their customer base evaporate. For the workers themselves, severance varied wildly depending on seniority and position. Those with decades on the line received better packages. But no amount of severance could replace a career, a way of life that they had expected to continue until retirement. The pensions that workers had earned became suddenly precarious. GM's bankruptcy had created uncertainty about what would be paid and when. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that backs private pensions, became involved. Some retirees saw their expected benefits reduced. Healthcare coverage, once a guaranteed benefit of working at Pontiac, became a maze of COBRA paperwork and uncertain timelines. And for the city of Pontiac, Michigan, the loss was catastrophic. Where do you go when your life's work disappears? For over 7,000 Pontiac workers, that question wasn't philosophical. It was immediate. It was urgent. It was the difference between keeping your house and losing it. Some found jobs at other GM facilities, plants that were still running, at least for now. They uprooted their families, moved to other cities, started over at the bottom of new seniority lists. It was better than nothing, but it wasn't home. Others looked for work in industries they'd never considered before. A lifetime of manufacturing skills didn't translate easily to the service economy that had replaced factory work across so much of America. Men and women in their 50s, with decades of experience building some of the most complex machines on Earth, found themselves competing for jobs that paid half what they'd earned and offered none of the benefits. Age discrimination was everywhere, even if nobody called it that. Employers looked at resumes that showed 30 years at one factory and saw workers who were expensive, set in their ways, and counting down to retirement. Why hire them when you could hire someone younger and cheaper? The statistics on what happened to displaced automotive workers are grim. Studies of similar factory closures found that many workers never found comparable employment. Some took jobs paying half or less of their previous wages. Others gave up looking entirely and dropped out of the workforce. Personal bankruptcies spiked. Home foreclosures increased. Families that had been solidly middle class for generations found themselves one step away from poverty. And then there were the costs that don't show up in economic data. Depression, anxiety, family strain, divorce, substance abuse. The psychological toll of losing not just a job, but an identity, of going from I build Pontiacs to I used to build Pontiacs, was devastating. Workers who had spent their entire adult lives providing for their families suddenly couldn't. The shame was crushing, even though the factory's death wasn't their fault. They'd done their jobs. They'd shown up every day. They'd built quality products, and still they were cast aside. Now let me show you what happened to the city of Pontiac, Michigan. Remember those 100,000 residents at peak population? Today, fewer than 60,000 people live in Pontiac. The city has lost nearly half its population. The unemployment rate spiked after the plant closure and has never fully recovered. At times, it reached double the national average. An entire generation grew up in a city where work was scarce and hope was scarcer. Property values collapsed. Homes that workers had saved for decades to buy became worth a fraction of their mortgages. People who tried to sell and move found no buyers. People who stayed watched their neighbors' houses fall into disrepair and foreclosure. The city's tax base crumbled. When you lose your biggest employer and thousands of homeowners, property tax revenue drops off a cliff. Schools that once sent kids to college couldn't afford basic supplies. Police and fire departments faced constant cuts. Roads went unrepaired. Streetlights stayed dark. The businesses that had grown up around the factory followed their customers into oblivion. The bars and diners that had cashed paychecks on Fridays closed their doors. The auto parts stores and uniform shops that served the plant had no one to serve. Downtown Pontiac, once thriving, became a monument to what was lost. Crime rose. When people are desperate, when they can't find work, can't pay rent, and can't feed their families, some turn to illegal alternatives. Drug epidemics that ravaged similar communities across the Rust Belt found fertile ground in Pontiac. I want to hear from you in the comments. Did you work here? Did your family? What do you remember about Pontiac, the cars, or the city? This history deserves to be preserved, and your stories matter. Share them below. I read every single one. And what about the factory itself? The 3 million square feet that once hummed with the energy of 10,000 workers? For years after the closure, the Pontiac assembly plant stood vacant. No buyer wanted it. What would you do with a facility that size, designed specifically for automobile manufacturing? Urban explorers, those photographers and adventurers who document abandoned places, found their way inside. They posted pictures online, massive empty halls where assembly lines once ran, executive offices with documents still scattered on desks, locker rooms where workers' personal items remained untouched. It became a monument to American industrial decline, a photographer's paradise and a city's shame. Over time, demolition began. Parts of the complex were torn down to prepare for something. Developers have proposed mixed-use redevelopment, retail, housing, modern facilities, but progress has been slow and uncertain. The site that once produced over 1,000 cars per day now sits mostly empty, waiting for a future that keeps getting postponed. Some historical preservation advocates have pushed for recognition, for some acknowledgement of what this place meant to American manufacturing. But there's no historical marker. No plaque explaining that 40 million cars were built here. No museum exhibit honoring the workers who spent their lives on these assembly lines. Just broken glass, rusted steel, and memories fading with each passing year. Here's what America lost when Pontiac died. Not just a car brand, not just a factory, a whole way of life. 60 years ago, a young man could graduate high school, walk into a factory like Pontiac Assembly, and, with hard work and loyalty, build a middle-class life. One paycheck covered the mortgage, the car payments, the groceries, the kids' shoes, and still left something for savings. That man's wife didn't have to work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. His children could focus on school instead of helping support the family. He could take his kids to ball games, plan family vacations. Imagine his grandchildren having even better opportunities. That's not nostalgia talking, that's mathematics. A single factory wage with union benefits could support an entire household at a standard of living that today requires 2 incomes, no pension, and constant anxiety. When Pontiac closed, when thousands of factories like it closed across the Midwest and the country, that calculation broke. The social contract that said work hard and you'll be rewarded was torn up and thrown away. What replaced it? Gig work, temp agencies, independent contractors with no health care, jobs that pay by the hour and schedule by the algorithm, work that treats humans as disposable inputs rather than valued contributors. The workers who built Pontiacs made something real, something tangible, something that moved and carried families, and became part of people's lives for years or decades. There's a dignity in that kind of work that no amount of corporate buzzwords about flexibility can replace. So who killed Pontiac? The easy answer, the answer that corporate executives would prefer, is market forces, competition from Japan, changing consumer preferences, unforeseeable economic circumstances. But that's a lie. GM's leadership made conscious choices year after year that guaranteed Pontiac's destruction. They chose to strip the brand of its unique identity. They chose to invest in short-term profits instead of long-term quality. They chose executive bonuses over factory modernization. They chose Wall Street over Main Street. Trade policies that encouraged offshoring, that made it cheaper to build cars in Mexico than Michigan, didn't write themselves. They were lobbied for by corporations and signed by politicians of both parties. Union leaders sometimes prioritized yesterday's contracts over tomorrow's competitiveness. But the workers they represented didn't tank Pontiac. They kept it running for decades despite inadequate investment and undermined product strategies. And all of us? Every American who chose the cheaper import, who prioritized price over origin, who stopped asking, "Where was this made?" We played our part too. There's plenty of blame to go around. But let's be clear about who had the power to save Pontiac and chose not to. General Motors leadership. They owned the brand. They controlled the investment. They made the decisions. They killed it. Pontiac is dead as a company, but it lives on in other ways. The collector market for classic Pontiacs is thriving. Original GTOs sell for six figures. Trans Ams, especially the black and gold models from the Smoky and the Bandit era, command premium prices. Car enthusiasts gather at shows across the country to celebrate what Pontiac once was. Online communities keep the memory alive. Restoration shops specialize in bringing old Pontiacs back to their original glory. Parts suppliers maintain inventory for vehicles that haven't been manufactured in decades. Museums preserve the most significant models. The Henry Ford Museum, the GM Heritage Center, private collections. Somewhere, carefully maintained, are examples of everything from the first Pontiac 6 to the final G6. Reunion groups gather former workers who still identify, decades later, as Pontiac people. They share stories, remember colleagues who've passed on, mourn what was lost. But here's what haunts me. This isn't just history. This is still happening. Right now, in communities across America, workers are facing what Pontiac workers faced. Factories are closing. Jobs are disappearing. Towns that built their identities around a single employer are watching that employer walk away. The Pontiac story isn't a cautionary tale from some distant past. It's a preview of what could happen, what is happening, everywhere. Go to Pontiac, Michigan today. Drive down South Opdyke Road to where the factory once stood. Park your car where 10,000 workers once parked theirs, and look around. The silence is what hits you first. This place used to roar with activity around the clock. 3 shifts of workers, and thousands of machines, an endless river of cars flowing out to dealers across America. Now there's nothing but wind and distant traffic. Walk closer to what remains of the buildings. See the broken windows, hundreds of them, staring like empty eye sockets. See the graffiti from urban explorers and vandals. See nature slowly reclaiming what humans built and abandoned. Somewhere in these ruins, there might still be an old Pontiac sign, a faded logo, a forgotten piece of equipment with the arrowhead still visible. The ghosts of 40 million cars. Think about the people who worked here. The man who installed engines for 30 years and watched his son start on the same line. The woman who fought for a spot in a traditionally male workspace and proved she could do the job as well as anyone. The retirees who still remember the smell of cutting oil and the sound of the end-of-shift whistle. They built something magnificent here. They built cars that fathers drove to their children's graduations, cars that carried families on summer vacations, cars that young men polished obsessively on Saturday afternoons, dreaming of impressing the girl down the street. All of it, the dreams, the labor, the pride, was thrown away by executives who never walked this factory floor, who never installed a bolt or painted a fender, who looked at spreadsheets instead of people and saw cost centers instead of lives. This is what remains of the American dream as it was once understood. Empty buildings and fading memories. A city still struggling to recover. Workers scattered to the winds. But here's what I want you to remember. The workers who built Pontiacs did nothing wrong. They showed up. They did their jobs. They built quality products. The failure was not theirs, and the story isn't over. Across this country, in 1,000 communities like Pontiac, the battle for American manufacturing continues. Workers fight to keep factories open. Organizers fight for fair wages. Politicians promise, and sometimes deliver, policies that support making things in America again. The Pontiac brand is dead, but the spirit of the workers who built it, their skill, their dedication, their belief that hard work should be rewarded with dignity, that doesn't have to die. Remember Pontiac. Remember what we built here. Remember what we lost, and don't let it happen again. If this story affected you, if it made you angry, or sad, or nostalgic, then we've done our job. There are hundreds of factories just like this one, all across America, with stories that need to be told. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you want to support this research, the link is in the description. These videos take weeks to make, but they're worth it to preserve this history. Drop a comment. What American company or factory do you want us to cover next? We're building a monument to American manufacturing, one video at a time.